The most common place of Muslim worship, the Friday Mosque, seems to perpetually be linked to a specific building type that is characterized by a dome or domical shape and towers for the call of prayer, minarets. Now, the prevalence of this mosque from the historic cities of Damascus, Isfahan, and Istanbul seemed to confirm this perception, which led to the Friday Mosque becoming understood as a universal symbol of Muslim places of prayer, and indeed a symbol of Islam itself. What I'd like to explore here today is part of my ongoing research on the function of the Friday Mosque and its evolution as a predominant architectural form. The main premise of my research is that the architectural and historical evidence from these same historical cities, and here I'll be talking about Damascus, Baghdad, and Isfahan, not Istanbul, seem to suggest that during the early periods of Islam, the presence of the Friday Mosque was actually the exception rather than the norm. My main question here is, if we as architectural historians understand the Friday Mosque to be the central emblem of Muslim religiosity, how can we explain its sporadic presence in Muslim medieval cities? It's okay, I think I'll do this. Thanks. In order to address the question of the meaning, function, and evolution of the Friday Mosque as an architectural program, I have first to take you on a journey to the Sultanate of Oman on the southeast tip of Arabia. Oh, sorry, that was not supposed to be here. This is the Sultanate of Oman, that southeast tip of Arabia. This is the Musandam Peninsula. I was actually looking, and we have here. So it borders on Iran from one side, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. I first have to take you on a journey to the Sultanate of Oman, where I carried a survey of historical mosques back in 2001 that triggered my curiosity and led to this current research. The richness and variety of Oman's environmental landscapes seen here on the screen is clearly mirrored by the richness of the mosque types that reflect regional influences and doctrinal beliefs. Whereas the coastal mosques in Oman, where coastal Oman is predominantly Sunni, Shafi'i, with mosques that have arcades and domes and minarets, seen here on the right. The country's mountainous region, which is the central region here, is predominantly Ibadi. And their mosques are small, no domes, no minarets, and as we'll see, no Friday mosques. Now, because this is a central part of the discussion today, I'm just reminding you of the difference between the different doctrinal group in Islam, because that has a big influence on the lecture. And what I'll do is I'll probably go back to the slide maybe twice before the end of my talk. To simplify, one of the main differences in the different doctrinal groups in Islam is the Sunnis, is the issue of the succession of the Prophet and how that is represented in the community. For the Sunni community, which is the majority of Muslims, the succession is usually through census and historically was based on the tribe from which the Prophet came, and the leader is called Imam or Caliph. For the Shia communities, now predominantly in Iran and parts of India and Lebanon and Syria, the idea of the succession is through succession through designation, and it is within the progeny of Ali and Fatima, and that means it's the male descendants of the Prophet. And there are, of course, within the Sunni and the Shia traditions, there are different doctrinal interpretations, but this is the area where we're focusing the most on today. And within the Shias, of course, the leader is the figure of religious authority is also known as Imam. We have a third doctrinal group. It's a minority group, no more than 2 million in the world, and they're predominantly in Oman and parts of North Africa, and they're known as the Ibadis. And for them, the imam or the leader could be anyone from the community, and it's a matter of electing that person. And the research that I did in Oman that triggered that whole question about the Friday mosque is related to the ibadis of Oman. And what I'll do today is I'll look at these three different traditions and how historically the interpretation of the role of the imam is reflected in the trajectory, the historical trajectory of Friday mosques, and how and when they started to be predominant in the landscape. Now, just briefly to take you through Oman, just because I think it's very interesting. A typical mosque in the Ibadi interior is usually small in size, built on a platform. There's no dome or minaret. We see the stepped stones here leading to the roof. Supposedly, this is what we call the staircase minaret, where the call for prayer is done from the roof of the mosque. They're tiny. This mosque is around 7 meters by 10 meters. And even though there are multiple doors, there's never a central access that leads to the mihrab area or to the area for the direction of prayer. And the interior, those supports, always, whatever the size of the mosque, and there are of course larger mosques, it always blocks the central aisle. Yet the mihrab itself, the indication of the direction of prayer, is huge. They have these very large mihrabs, usually around 4 meter by 7 meter, carved stucco, and I published that as part of my research on Oman back in 2008. We have 23 signed and dated mihrabs from the 16th century, dating to that period. But the mosque type that we generally identify as the Congregational or Friday mosques that forms the bulk of historical mosques surviving in places such as Istanbul, Cairo, or Isfahan is significantly limited in the Ibadi interior of Oman. And in the survey that I did, I surveyed 120 historical mosques, out of which there was only 6 Friday mosques. Everything else was a small masjid or a small mosque typical of the one we've seen earlier. So this is the typical, and we have very few Friday mosques, and when you have them, of course, they typically have a minbar or the pulpit for the Friday sermon. Now, the main question for me back in 2001 was how come there was such a limited number of Friday mosques in Oman? Oman is a vast country. It is as large as the United Kingdom. It's huge. For it to have 6 Friday mosques is quite perplexing. And I've recently really started to understand why they have so many limited number of mosques, and that started this whole research. Now, scholars like Paulo Costa, who published on the Islamic architecture of Oman, both in 1997 and in 2001, attributed the limited number of Friday mosques to the notion of conservatism. He said that bodies are conservative, therefore they don't want to change things, so they don't build Friday mosques. This argument that I questioned, not only because Ibadi mosques have some far from conservative features, so those large mihrabs, the large niches in the direction of prayer are not conservative at all, and several of them are embedded with 16th century blue and white Chinese ceramics that are, freshly imported from China, some of which have phoenix in the center of the mihrab, phoenix and other types of birds. So, they really are not conservative when one looks closely. But also this whole question reminded me of many, many years ago when I was reading the introduction on the minbar or the pulpit for the Friday prayer in something as generic as the Encyclopedia of Islam. I was reading the entry there, and in passing it says that it's only in 749 that the Umayyad rulers, wanting to make sure that their word is heard in every city, they allowed more minbars to be built. So that statement tells us that in the first 80 years of the nascent Muslim community, there were hardly any Friday mosques anywhere, and I'll tell you now what was happening before 749 in a minute. Again, Oman's limited number of mosques reminded me of something else. These are things that as historians of Islamic art, going through our initial courses, we go through, we know them, but in a sense, it all began to fall in place. If reading Herzfeld's Architecture of Damascus, published in 1948, he discusses the habit of not having more than one Friday mosque in a city, completely for granted. Of course, they don't have more than one Friday mosque in a city. So bearing this in mind, the limited number of Friday mosques in a place like Oman only for me served to raise two questions. First, the art historical discourse on the Friday mosque predominantly focuses on issues of style and patronage. So what do we really know about the Friday mosque and its history and function? Now, the second question was, can the discourse on the Friday mosque by a religious minority like the Ibadis of Oman inform the art historical understanding of the Friday mosque as an architectural paradigm? And that's the main question that I'll address today. So, again, just a reminder that it's all about the definition of the Imam. I'll come back to that. First, let me review the evidence from Damascus and Baghdad. In his studies on Damascus architecture, Herzfeld suggests that because traditionally no town had more than one Friday mosque with a Friday sermon or a khutbah, the great Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, built in the early 8th century, remained the main and only Friday mosque in the city until the new mosque, the Mosque of the Hanbalite, which was built in the suburb of Salhiyya, outside the city, in the early 13th century, in 1202. So for the first 500 years of the history of Muslim community in Damascus, there was only one Friday mosque. What Herzfeld doesn't question is really how limited the number of people doing the Friday prayer, which we take as a central emblem of Muslim religiosity, was for the first 500 years of Damascus. And I did the undoable, and it's just to make me try and understand how many people would be there. If we stack people like sardines, and I'm not taking the structure here in context, you can have. Do that. You can have more. You can have no more than 4,000 people within the hall itself, and maybe 5,000 if you really stack people like sardines. And we don't have exact figures that I know of, and Nasser, I'll be happy if you correct me on that. No, let's go back to here. We don't have exact figures on the population of Damascus, but there is a dramatic discrepancy between the population and number of people who possibly perform the Friday prayer. The unique position of the Great Umayyad Mosque as the sole Friday mosque in Damascus for 500 years conforms to Ibn Asakir's early 12th century description of the city, where he mentions one Friday mosque only, where there was 242 small masjids. By the 14th century, the historian Al-Irbili listed two Friday mosques, and that would be the mosque, the Damascus mosque, and the one in the citadel that was built in the 12th century, I think. But he lists 15 Friday mosques beginning to be built in the suburbs around the city. So within the city itself, you have the Damascus mosque, you have the mosque in the citadel, and then everything else is outside the city. This suggests that Damascus had 17 Friday mosques in the 14th century, which that's according to An-Naimi, who died in 1520. And this number was raised to 31 mosques under the Ottomans. And Guru, I would appreciate your comment when I finish on what's happening under the Ottomans. So we have if you do a longue-durée look at the number of mosques built and question that in relationship to the number of people who potentially could do the Friday prayer, the discrepancy is amazing in what happened especially in the 16th century, and the fact that in the early period there was so little. Here we have a mixed period when we have mosques and madrasas, so this I think needs further exploration, but I think I'd like to contrast these two. So what about the population numbers? Now, the earliest stable population number that I know of is under the Ottomans in the early 16th century, where they talk about 52,000 to 57,000 inhabitants. I don't have the population figures for the 11th century. I think the 11th century would be a good place to start, and I would appreciate suggestions, Nasser, if you have any idea about that. In short, there seems to have been no change in the number of people able to perform the Friday prayer for almost 500 years. And that the main increase started slowly, trickled with the Ayyubids, and then with the Ottomans, there was a major shift. If we look at Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate from 752 until 1258, the situation seems to be similar. In his book on the topography of Baghdad, Jacob Lassner discussed the Friday Mosque based on his translations of the 11th century history of Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. Briefly, he informs us that the first mosque built by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur at the center of the round city was later replaced by a larger mosque by Harun al-Rashid. We're also told that later in the 19th century, the Caliph al-Mu'tadid Billah was informed that there isn't enough space for worshippers who wish to do the Friday prayer, and this compelled people to, and I quote, pray Friday prayers in places in which the Friday prayer was not permissible, end of quote. So the mosque, the Friday mosque, was enlarged. Did we not? So because people were praying in places where they're not permitted to pray, he enlarged the mosque yet again. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi then justifies the building of additional mosques in the outskirts of the city beyond the walls. For example, in 940, the Caliph al-Muttaqi built al-Baratha Mosque with a justification that it technically falls beyond the wall, so it's a different city altogether. Also interesting is in al-Baghdadi's narration is his story of the Friday mosque built in the fief of Ja'far, again in the late 10th century. And I quote, "This request to establish the mosque was based on the assertion that the mosque was situated beyond the moat, which divided it from the town." He used the term balad, thus marking the area in which the mosque was situated as a town in its own right, end of quote. Al-Istakhri mentions then the increase of the number of the Friday mosques in the 10th century from one in the 8th century to 5, one being in the city of Baghdad and the rest are in the suburbs. In comparison, we have the 5 Friday mosque. Baghdad at the time had more than 10,000 public baths. Now, this story about Baghdad is something we know from the study of every early mosque architecture. So if we think of Cordoba, the same idea, the mosque keeps being enlarged in its same place again and again and again, and then later they build something in a separate city. Or if we think of Fez, if we think it's a repetitive pattern, the idea of not wanting to do another Friday mosque in the city. So to paraphrase, for the 2 major cities of the Muslim world in the early period, so here from the 8th to the 13th century, there was only 1 Friday mosque in each city. When new Friday mosques were added, it was always based on the argument that the new mosque is built in a different suburb, and usually beyond the walls. The architectural and historical evidence thus suggests that during the early period, the Friday mosque the Friday mosque as an architectural paradigm did not dominate the urban skyline. So we go back to the main question of, if we understand the Friday mosque to be the central emblem of Muslim religiosity, as it's been understood from the beginning of from the 19th century identification of what is Islamic architecture and what is the type of architecture that we should be looking at, and how do we define Muslims and how do we define Islamic architecture. So it's all linked to that debate. Now, to answer the answer to this question lies not in the architectural record, as a thrust of research and publications on mosque architecture have focused primarily on the building styles and architectural patronage. Rather, it lies in the ways in which Muslim legal literature defined the function of the Friday mosque and designated a hierarchy amongst mosques. The masjids, where the daily prayers are performed, and the Friday mosques or the jamas, based on the mosque's direct relationship to political authority, and more specifically to the relationship to the institution of the imamate. So the definition of the imam, as we've seen in the different interpretations. Now, in the next section of this paper, I will examine the Friday prayer mosque from a Muslim legal perspective, and actually I'll examine the Friday prayer from a Muslim legal perspective and demonstrate that there exists an extensive discourse on the meaning, function, and history of the Friday mosque that is now just beginning to be explored. And I don't want to drive you crazy, but these are the terms that I will be using. I'll be using the term imam, and I'll be discussing from the perspective of the ibadis, because I found a discourse that would make it very, for the purpose of a lecture, it would be the easiest way to put the discourse forward, and then I'll move from that to the Shia context. And of course, the ibadis and the Shiis use the Sunni arguments, and as such, we'll be going through the three different arguments. So, in a series of legal opinions, known as jawabat, issued by the Ibadi scholar Nuruddin Salami, we find the following question. And we'll see, he died in the early 20th century. So this is a very late question, but it's a didactic question. The question is based on the idea of, let me ask you a question so that I can tell you how to answer it. It's not, I don't think it's a real question. But it's a question that we have, once I started looking for it, it exists quite a lot in the Ibadi legal literature. And there are so many different discourses on why and how the Ibadis understand the Friday prayer. So the question is, why don't Ibadis pray the Friday prayer even though it is an obligation in the Quran? Now, Salami answers, and his answer uses both terms, Imam and Misr. And for the general discussion, we'll call Misr as the city or designated urban center, and the Imam as the leader of the community. So Salami's question is paraphrased into the following. First, regarding the obligation of the Friday prayer. Yes, Salami answers, the Friday prayer is an obligation in the Quran and the Sunnah. This obligation derives from the Quranic verse, O ye who believe, when the call is heard for prayer on the day of congregation, or al-Jum'ah, hasten to the remembrance of God and leave your trading. So the only time that the Friday prayer is mentioned in the Quran is in this verse that enjoins Muslims, when they hear the call for prayer on the Friday, to go to the collective prayer. Salami then explains that the clarification of the particulars of the Friday prayer were taught through the traditions and actions of Prophet Muhammad in the same way that the particularities of other ritual obligations, such as the daily prayers, almsgiving, pilgrimage, were taught. So what the Quran has, the Quran is not a law book, it has principles, it just says pray. And in a sense, the practice of prayer was taught over time through the practice of the Prophet, and it evolved from that. So what Salami is saying, yes, it is an obligation, but we have to see how it was practiced during the time of the Prophet, the way he is arguing, and let me tell you what the Prophet is telling us about it. So basically he's saying that based on the Sunnah of the Prophet, the Friday prayer is an obligation only under certain conditions. So it's different from the everyday prayer. It's not an obligation on everybody. It's a conditional obligation. And the condition is with an imam and in a misr. In addressing the two conditions, imam and misr, Salami turns to the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, or the hadith, in order to demonstrate that the Sunnah of the Prophet dictates that the Friday prayer is conditional, and as such, different from the daily ritual prayers. And, once you start reading about the Friday prayer, it's very different. It's an obligation, even in the evolution of how it became an obligation. It's not an obligation on women, it's an obligation on men. And it's an obligation on men if it wasn't too cold outside, if they're not very far from the mosque, if they can hear the call for the prayer. This is very different from the ritual prayers, which are obligations equally on everyone all the time, from the Sunni perspective. So As-Salami, in one hadith of the Prophet is reported to have said, 4 things are a prerogative of the Imam: the collection of war booty, the collection of voluntary almsgiving, the legal punishments, and the holding of Friday prayers. So there's this discourse in the early literature of hadith, and we can raise questions about hadith, but I think we should take hadith as a didactic device of what were the discourses at the time that that specific hadith became popular. But it's all linking the Friday prayer with the prerogative role of the Imam. Now, As-Salami's evidence for Misr as a condition for the obligation of Friday prayer also comes from the Sunnah. So the Ibadis are using Sunni discussions and Sunni perspectives, including Sunni scholars all the way up into the 19th century, to discuss their argument. And they're saying, we're not different from them, we're only different in the way we identify Imam. And as such, they started building Friday mosques in the 20th century. He first quotes the hadith, which is no Friday prayer except in an all-encompassing town, or al-Misr al-Jami'. And we'll see now that al-Misr al-Jami' is it here? No, not yet. In a Misr al-Jami'. And then he reminds us that during the lifetime of the Prophet, the performance of the Friday prayer in Medina took place only in the Prophet's mosque, even though Medina itself had several suburbs. And basically, we have stories in the early histories about people wanting to go for prayer and told, no, you can't, because you have to walk from your suburbs all the way to Medina to the main mosque to pray. Now, it was only during the caliphate of the second Caliph Umar, who ruled from 634 to 644, that 7 additional locales, or misrs, garrison towns, were designated as misr and allowed to hold Friday prayers. And those are Mecca, Medina in Saudi, Basra and Kufa in Iraq, Yemen, Sham, as in Damascus, and Bahrain and Oman were designated as one misr, and that mosque was in the city of Suhar in modern-day Oman. These were the only places where the Friday prayer was held until the Umayyads started the propagating of the minbar in 745. So in the first 80 years, we have 7 Friday mosques. So what changed, and why did the Friday mosque become the norm? The answer lies in the difference in the legal definition of the term Imam amongst the various schools of interpretation. According to the Ibadi creed, the Imam is the best man elected for the leadership of the community based on his knowledge and piety, without any regard to race or lineage. These elected Imams have the prerogative of leading the Friday prayer. And their concept of Imam is not the leader of any prayer in the mosque, but it's the equivalent of the caliph. So they equate the Ibadi Imam to, for example, the Caliph Omar or any of the caliphs who came after that. So the leaders of the 7 misrs. The Ibadi understanding of the term Misr is also discussed by Salami, where he explains that the coastal city of Suhar, which is north of Muscat, the main city, was one of the Misrs originally designated by the Caliph Umar, and as such, the only place where the Friday prayer was held in Oman. Thus, as Salami explains, Ibadi Imams who did not live in Suhar, and most of them didn't, they lived in the central part of Oman in Nizwa, they just didn't perform the Friday prayer. So they linked both the Imam and the Misr together. And so even if they have an Imam and the Imam doesn't live in Suhar, there was no Friday prayer. Again, this changed around the 11th century when in the Sunni world, the Ayyubids started introducing an additional Friday prayer in fortified areas as a different city. So they started doing that. But again, very, very limited and always linked to the condition of where the Imam lives. So during the lifetime, for example, of the Ibadi Imam, Al-Warith bin Ka'b al-Kharusi, who ruled between 796 and 808, no Friday prayers were held in Nizwa, where he lived and ruled. The legal principle here is that all Oman is one Misr, and that the villages and towns of Oman can be compared to the villages and towns around the Medina during the lifetime of the Prophet. The Ibadi discourse on the Friday prayer and Friday mosques is by no means unique. It reflects a broader debate in the Muslim legal literature about the conditions and validity of the Friday prayer, the legal definitions of cities, and the nature of political power. For example, the Sunni Shafi'i scholar Ibn Kaj, who died in 1015, argues the Jum'ah, or Friday prayer, is an obligation that is incumbent on the whole community that can be fulfilled by some of its members, so fard kifaya, in respect to the whole Muslim community. But it is an individual obligation in respect of those who are living in the Misr of the Imam. So what he's arguing in simple terms is, if we think educating children is an obligation on the nation as a whole, but it's only people who are qualified as teachers for children can do the teaching. And as a result, it's an obligation that is fulfilled if only a few people fulfill it. And that's the way that he approached the Friday prayer. So from the Sunni perspective, and here I'm quoting Professor Baber Johansson from the School of Law here, and his divinity school or School of Law, divinity. He has a wonderful article on the Al-Misr al-Jami', on the definition of the Misr, the legal definition of the Misr. And again, no one here will be surprised that Oleg Grabar has raised that question in an article in 1968, but no one picked it up and it was never discussed. Grabar was trying to theorize the city through the mosque, but never picked up on that. Sorry, I lost where I am. From the Sunni perspective, the manner in which 24 Sunni jurists writing between the 8th and the 19th century defined the term al-Misr al-Jami', the technical legal term denoting a town in which a Friday prayer may be validly held, can be seen here in the slide. They're very different definitions, and they're all still trying to grapple with the idea of how can we define a city, what's the link between the city and the mosque, and what's the link between the city and the representation of power. And there's much more approach to that idea of the relationship between the mosque and power by our colleagues in Islamic law. So for example, Norman Calder has an article where he discusses that concept of when can you mention the name of the imam in the mosque that is vital in our understanding on what the Friday prayer means. But what is very clear is that within the Sunni Hanafi school, there were different criteria in which a locale became defined as a city, and as such a place that was allowed to have a Friday prayer. But one of the most significant findings is that there is an undercurrent pious opposition against to the recognition of recognition of Friday mosques in the cities that you see all the way into the 19th century in the Sunni legal literature. Now, having said that, we know that there's been, like, in a sense, there's debates amongst the scholars themselves about when to allow these Friday mosques, and they're all uncomfortable with them. Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century talks about mosques not as mosques, but when he's talking about political power, and he says, he's discussing the role of political power and authority, and then he talks about the Friday mosque in that, and he says, for those who think that the Friday prayer is essential. You know, that's the way he approaches it. Now, let me finish by demonstrating that the Friday mosques were also debated as a doctrinal issue for Shi'is, albeit with a slight difference from the discourse of the Sunnis and the Ibadis. And I will turn, and this is actually very preliminary research, but to point you to the idea of how prevalent that debate was within the three doctrinal groups. And therefore, Shi'is, as we'll turn to Isfahan, because in some sense, it's the first capital of a centralized imperial 12-ver Shi'i sovereignty. It became capital in 1597. And I am aware that I'm missing something major here, which is Cairo, the formation of Cairo. Let me see if I've added, no, I haven't. The formation of Cairo, but I haven't done any research on the Fatimid sources, legal sources. But one should keep in the back of our mind that sort of evolution from the Mosque of Amr, then the movement into a different Misr and have the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, and that sort of shifting center of the city, and that even when Cairo itself was formed, the first mosque when Al-Hakam built his mosque, it was outside the wall, and it was only later that it was included within the city. So it seems that there is something there, but I haven't done any research on it yet. Now, until the Safavid rise to power in the early 16th century, the population of what is now modern Iran was predominantly Sunni. Isfahan's first congregational mosque, seen here in the slide, and its different evolutions. It was built in the Old Bazaar under the Sunni Abbasids in the 8th century with continuous additions and expansions. And it remained the only Friday mosque in Isfahan until the construction of Shah Abbas's mosque, which is, so here we have the old city and the Friday mosque, which was expanded gradually from the 8th century to the 17th century. And then we have, within the walled city, we have the Maidan, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then the Mosque of Shah Abbas that was built in the early 17th century. And it's seen here at the end of the Maidan. We'll also mention the Mosque of Sheikh Lutfullah, the small mosque here. As part of their attempt to consolidate the new state, the Safavids sought to standardize Shia practice amongst the ruling elites and disseminate a distinctly Shia tradition amongst the popular classes. In order to achieve this and maintain their power of the local clergy or ulama, the Safavids imported Shia scholars from the Arabic-speaking regions of Jabal Amil in modern-day Lebanon. These Amili scholars, these Shia Amili scholars, including Sheikh Lutfullah al-Maisi, who died in 1622, whose mosque we see here on the screen, provided the monarchs with arguments that reconciled the Safavid claim to power with the central Shia precept of the Imam's occultation. Now, for the Shi'is, they link the idea of the Imam to the descendants of Ali, and with the idea that the 12th Imam went into occultation. And from that time until the rise of the Safavid states, there wasn't a kingship, an authority that claimed, other than the Fatimids, but that's a separate story, claimed a Muslim empire and an authority. And there was a real fight throughout the 16th and 17th century, and tons of ink spilled on the debate over, can you have a monarchy when you have occultation, when you have the Imam is not present? And that debate centered around the Friday prayer and the Friday mosque, because that was the way to discuss it. The Amili scholars were instrumental in introducing new legal opinions based on inference from existing principles. So they used ijtihad, and also they used the model of what was happening within the Ottoman realm, because of course they come from Lebanon. They are versed with the Sunni tradition of both ijtihad and the idea of ijma', so the consensus between the ulama. So they brought their experience, but they are learned Shia scholars, and they in a sense married their tradition to justify and explain the idea of Safavid monarchy. For this paper's purpose, the Shia legal literature of the 16th century and early 17th century is full of debates concerning the legitimacy or lack of the Friday prayer, including how, when, and who can perform it. Here, the concern of the Shia scholars was how can Shias perform Friday prayer during the occultation of the Imam, which is, of course, one of the conditions of the Friday prayer, as we've seen for everybody, is the presence of the Imam. So if your central tenet is the Imam is in occultation, how can you have Friday prayer? Yet if you want symbols of legitimacy, what a better symbol of legitimacy than the Friday sermon? And as a result, the Amili scholars found a way to bring the two together. The Amili scholars understood the Friday prayer and the presence of Friday mosque as much needed legitimizing symbols for Safavid imperial sovereignty. both internally with the populace and externally, of course, with the Ottomans. Their legal opinions varied from making the Friday prayer permissible only in the presence of high-ranking scholars, and that's how it started in the early 16th century under Al-Karaki, who was the first Amili scholar to sort of move to Qazvin. At the time, he moved to Mashhad and then to Qazvin because the capital was there. And they wanted to move to separate the political power from the role of the Friday prayer and have a mujtahid do the performance of the Friday prayer. And until, of course, Sheikh Lutfullah, who was also the father-in-law of Shah Abbas, his view made it incumbent on every Shia male to perform the Friday prayer. And he argued that the Safavids are a Alid dynasty, they're descendants of Ali, they have pure descent, and as such, they are the legitimate imams, and as such, they can lead the Friday prayer. The Shia scholarly debate on the role of imam and the confirmation of the permissibility of Friday prayer is physically reflected in the architectural evolution of the Maidan Shah. So that's the main building program under Shah Abbas, which included in the early 16th century, not the early 16th century, the early 17th century, Ali Kapu, the entrance, the portal, the Ali Kapu, which is the building that it's designed as a portal, but it was where where you watch the ceremonies taking place in the Maidan. Sheikh Lutfullah's mosque, which was built early on, was the first built, and all the literature, the art historical literature, talks about it as the mosque chapel, which is not a concept that I've seen anywhere in the legal literature or in the local literature. It's something that I think we designated as a chapel mosque. I have not come across this. I'd be happy if someone corrects me. And then the last project that was built only after there was this designation of it's incumbent on everyone to do the Friday prayer, that they lastly built that Friday mosque. Although the Masjid al-Shah became the new Friday mosque of the city, its construction as the last building block of this urban scheme surely reflects the unease inherent in the Friday prayer debates of the Twelver Shi'is. It also reflects the Safavid strategic push towards confirming their sovereignty and their right to convene Friday prayers, to appoint deputies to perform the prayers on their behalf. Let me give you some preliminary conclusions by taking you back to one of the main doctrinal differences between the Sunni Shi'is and... I did include this. I always thought that, before I go to the conclusions, that this very early reconstruction of the evolution of Cairo was interesting. I think it's a place where one should start research to see where there was there a debate about building the different Friday mosque in the different places. Was that part of the moving of the location of the city? And I haven't done this research yet. Again, when it comes to the reconstruction of Fatimid Cairo, it has always been pointed that Al-Hakim's mosque was built outside the walls, and it was the place that was there as a musalla first, and then later it was included within the boundaries of the city. Let me give you some preliminary conclusions by taking you back to the doctrinal issues. And this is the looking at the difference between Sunni Shi'is and Ibadis, and how this doctrinal difference is directly related to the longue durée history of the Friday mosque. For Sunnis, the focus of the debate was the sovereignty of the Imam Caliph and his direct representation in cities in his vast domain, or in the vast domain under his control. The minbar of the Friday mosque became a symbolic designation of the city. The increase of the number of Friday mosques was slow and gradual, with an exponential growth under the Ottomans, and it was always justified legally. For Shi'is, the discussion of the Friday mosques is linked directly to the doctrinal issue of the permissibility of the Friday prayer during the occultation of the 12th Imam. So from the 10th century, the idea was, between the 10th century and the 17th century, there was no Shia Friday prayer that we know of. And it started in the 17th century when they created the new discussion and debate, when they revisited the question and reconciled the concept of ghaiba or occultation with the concept of the Safavid state. It was only under the Safavids in the 17th century that the Iranian model of kingship and the doctrinal interpretation of the imamate were brought together in the form of the establishment of the Friday prayers as individual duty and the construction of Friday mosques. For the Ibadis, both the reconciliation of their doctrinal definition of imam and of Misr took place only in the early 20th century and predominantly under the tutelage of the British, who had a perceived views of Islam that is based on the centrality of the Friday prayer as an emblem of Muslim life. And actually, I did some research on in a sense, the building code, the code in use in Oman from the construction, from the beginning of the Sultanate, which was renewed in the 1970s until our current day, and the discussion of the building of mosques is completely opposite to everything that is historically there, but it's linked to that idea of Islamic architecture looks like this. It has to be a mosque with a dome and a minaret and glazed tiles. All these things that are very foreign to Ibadis, but also doctrinally unacceptable to them. And there's a tension in Oman, political tension in Oman about that until our current day. This ongoing research on the Friday prayer and Friday mosque brings forth 2 points for future research. The first is architectural, suggesting that one cannot use the notion of stylistic regionalism to explain all architectural differences, especially for something as central to the study of Islamic architecture as Friday mosques. Difference, as I hope I've demonstrated, can reflect more nuanced realities embedded in diversity, here the diversity of legal interpretation. This also suggests that any discussion of mosque architecture will really benefit from better understanding of the institution of ritual prayer. And again, while I was doing this research and I went back to reading the introduction of Oleg Grabar's book on the Mosque of Isfahan, and it's actually a good read because here is was it 79 or 82, writing this book on the Friday mosque, and the introduction is all about his awe and of seeing people praying in the mosque. And he's saying, you know what, we think of it as a building and we never think of the prayer that takes place in it. And he's surprised, he's sort of taken by surprise, and it intrigues him. So I thought it was excellent. Now, the second point to explore is that the longue durée approach to the Friday mosque inevitably raises many questions about the cities in which they are built. The legal definition of a Misr, its relationship to Friday mosque, and its role as a paradigm in Muslim urban life, I would argue, will inevitably reintroduce the long-forgotten debate about the Islamic city. Thank you.